Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our co-sponsors this evening, the American Book Center, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Richard Warren Brewster, presenting his new book, Witchcraft Legacy, Stories from the Big Attic, joined in conversation by Gretchen Grant. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening. In just a moment, I'll turn you over to Protean Press publisher Laura Fillmore, who will be introducing our program this evening. But first, just a few housekeeping notes. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll get through as many as time allows. We also have auto-generated closed captioning available for this event. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You may also disable them there as well if they are auto-enabled. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase Witchcraft Legacy from Harvard Bookstore and the American Book Center. Your purchases make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore and this author series. Thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, and indie bookselling. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, if we encounter any tech issues during the event tonight, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to turn things over to Laura Fillmore. Laura Fillmore founded Protean Press's parent company, Open Book Systems, in 1932. Since that time, Open Book Systems has produced hundreds of books, journals, and internet-based publishing solutions for leading publishers around the world. Laura, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Serena. And just one brief correction, not 1932, 1982.
Yes, I misread there. Thank you. I thought that seemed very, very
long run we've had here. And the latest book that we've brought out is Richard Brewster's Witchcraft Legacy, printed at the Harvard Bookstore and American Book Center in Amsterdam in Europe. And I'm so grateful to both the Harvard Bookstore and abc.nl for hosting the event tonight and inviting Richard Warren Brewster to come and talk about stories from the Big Attic, his Witchcraft Legacy book. Richard is an attorney in New York City, and he's a graduate of Princeton as an undergrad and Harvard Law School. And in his work as a mediator in New York, he frequently engages in talking circles with people to arbitrate things. And in so doing, he was inspired to come up with stories from his own family history, which I'm sure you're all eager to hear. Tonight is going to be in conversation with a near and dear friend of his, Gretchen Grant, who is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Business School, and she is currently the CEO of DailyFX, a leading digital publisher in foreign exchange, commodities, and indices. But tonight, their story is on a much more personal family level about the legacy of witchcraft over generations that was started by a book that Rich and his brother found in the attic when they were boys. I will say no more and turn it over to Gretchen and Rich.
Thanks so much, Laura.
Thanks very much, Laura. Gretchen, you and I have known each other for, I think, about 30 years, right?
The math must be wrong.
and I think it's like the 1932 math with Laura, but it seems it really is over 30 years, and you've known my much better half for 5 or 10 years longer than that. So, and I'm really excited that you can join me in the conversation. But before we get started in the conversation, I just wanted to, we both on opposite sides of the river doing our graduate work had occasion to enjoy the Harvard Bookstore. And I want to, it brings back a lot of memories for me. And I want to thank the Harvard Bookstore and the co-sponsor, the American Book Center in Amsterdam, and also the wonderful Laura Fillmore and Protean Press and the entire Protean Press team, and Matt Hertzfeld, who has been helping me valiantly get the word out and to teach me how to understand social media, which is hard when you go back as far as 1932 or close to it. But anyway, I just wanted to express my gratitude to everybody who's been involved in this effort. So that's it. Gretchen, take it away.
All right, and what a wonderful pleasure it's been to read the book as it evolved and came to its final shape, available on those bookshelves at Harvard Bookstore and ABC. Now, I would love to dive into something that took place really just over the last 18 months. You mentioned in the introduction, Rich, that COVID had a part to play in you writing the book. How did that connect?
Well, honestly, Gretchen, the lockdown is everything in terms of my writing the book. It was very important in two ways. First of all, it gave me the time to write the book. I went on Zoom and I did a lot of things on Zoom like all of us, but I did have more time, so I got into the writing project. But secondly, the lockdown locked me and a colleague of mine out of a class that we were teaching in one of the New York State prisons. And we were teaching negotiation and communication and conflict resolution in a men's prison, using the Native American talking circle as the teaching format. And so at the time of the lockdown, the talking circle was very much on my mind, and it had a very powerful impact on me. So that's reflected in the book because the circle is all over the book. And you know, we can talk about that to whatever extent you want to, but in both of those ways, the COVID lockdown had everything to do with my writing the book and even the shape of the book.
Mm-hmm. And the circle, that sounds so intriguing, Rich. Tell us a little bit more. What is a conversation circle, or a talk circle as Laura referred to it as, and how did that inspire you or color the book?
Well, I mean, it's a very fascinating thing to me, and it's coincidental that we're having this event on Indigenous Peoples Day because we're talking about the Native American circle, in which the key feature is passing what's called a talking piece around the circle, and only the person who holds the talking piece speaks, and everybody else listens. It's without interruption, without judgment, just listens. And then each person in the circle takes their turn and says whatever they want to say. And I found it to be an incredibly powerful process. And I think that the one thing that came across to me and really was taught to me or driven home for me by the men and women that I used this format with was that something that I'd always believed in, but I think was really driven home, and that is the intimate and infinite connection of all humanity and human experience. And it comes out in the circle. And if I could just maybe read a little bit of what I said about the talking circle.
Absolutely.
In Witchcraft Legacy.
Please.
And this is in the final chapter. When stories are shared in a circle, as the talking piece is passed around, regardless of the age, gender, or race of those present, a bond is created. Rather than being exclusive, the circle is inclusive. It is both intimate and infinite. When the holders of the talking piece tell stories from the heart and others listen without interruption or judgment, They become connected like the circle itself. They experience the connection with each other and with all humanity. There is no us and them. There is only us. The circle is the world.
Mhm. Was that shared humanity one of the themes that you wanted to bring out in the book, Rich? Was that bubbling up?
Very much so, because I think the book, it's I don't know what you would call it. It's a juxtaposition or something. The book is about an incredibly narrow splinter of American society, starting out with the early, Puritan settlers in New England, and a group that's now become extraordinarily narrow in terms of the great diversity of American society. And what I was trying to communicate in each of the stories was that regardless of the narrow nature of the people whose stories are told, the stories are universal human stories of life experience. And if I succeeded in any measure in that respect, I'll be pleased, but that was my goal.
Wonderful. I think that came through beautifully. And I also would like to lead us into one of those stories. I thought a lot about curses and blessings as I read the stories and had the pleasure of hearing you speak many of them over the years. And I wonder if you could start us off with what was that original quote of William Stoughton's that you saw written in the book that seemed to suggest a kind of family curse or raise that idea in your 11-year-old boy's mind. And in addition to the quote, what's one of the stories, can you summarize one of the stories that seemed to illustrate to you that there was a family curse?
Sure. Well, the curse itself, I mean, you have to visualize, and it's actually in the appendix in the book, but this crabbed, to me, kind of Gothic handwriting from the 1600s. And here's the one thing that my brother and I were able to make out. It is at the top of the page on the flyleaf. These evil spirits haunt me every day and will not let me eat, hear, read, or pray. That just totally creeped us out. And I think we saw a family curse. And as you asked about, well, how did I relate that? Well, we heard things whispered around the house that I think made us think maybe there was some kind of family curse. And one of them was that we'd always been told that my father's brother was a World War I fighter pilot, a hero who was shot down in combat and escaped, and was an amazing person. And we didn't know much other than that. He wasn't around anymore, so we never met him. And then whispered through the doors, we overheard conversations that led us to understand there was much to the rest of the story. And the rest of the story was that he came back from World War I and he married his sweetheart. And in 1926, he found out that she was having an affair with someone, and it ended up with him killing her and then committing suicide. So we learned about this murder-suicide, and I think it fed right into the evil spirits that we thought, and maybe that's just one example, but it was certainly a powerful and disturbing thing that we heard about through a closed door, and eventually fleshed out as we grew up and learned more about it.
Very disturbing indeed. And help me locate the timing. Did you know that story, or had you heard those whispers when you were in that attic discovering these creepy books and almost indecipherable handwriting, or did you learn about that story after the attic experience?
No, it was after the attic experience, and we heard it through the door between our bedroom and the next bedroom and the down the hall in the house where we lived. The next floor down from the big attic where we found the book.
Amazing. I was also struck by the blessings and the appreciation of life that you describe in many of the stories. And I'm thinking about the story that involved the Magnum 300. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and what were you doing with the Magnum anyway? And what were you doing in Alaska?
No,
Other than reading the
certainly,
book.
I'll get into that, but I think every one of the stories asks a question or offers a possible answer to the question of, are we cursed by evil spirits or protected by guardian angels? And depending on the particular story, you can sort of tease out a different answer to that question. Or in the chapter that you mentioned called My 300 H&H Magnum, after junior year at Princeton, I went to Alaska and I went on a hunting trip with a friend, and I got on the plane, which you could never do now. This is in August 1963, and everything changed a few months later for reasons we all know. I got on a plane with my 300 H&H Magnum in a case over my shoulder and handed it to the flight attendant and said, "You got someplace you can put this?" And anyway, so I went to Alaska, and I got into a situation before we went hunting. I was talked into a situation, and I volunteered my services in a situation involving the 300 H&H Magnum, which was incredibly stupid. And I could have ended up I think, in prison for the rest of my life if things had turned out a little differently. But lucky for me, they turned out fine. I got back on the plane to New York. I didn't go to prison in Alaska, and I went on to graduate from college and on to law school. But at the end of that chapter, I speak about what this makes me think of, which is Joan Baez's version of the curse versus blessings question. And my grandmother, and I think a lot of people's grandmothers, used to say, "Well, there, but for the grace of God, go I." Right. You know, we'd all be jailbait, but for the grace of God. And Joan Baez puts a 60s twist on it, she wrote a song about prison and men going to prison. And I quoted at the end of the chapter where I think I escaped that fate by whatever, guardian angels or the luck of the draw. And Joan Baez's song, the lyrics include these lines: "Show me the prison, show me the jail, show me the prisoner whose life has gone stale, and I'll show you a young man with so many reasons why, and there but for fortune go you or I." So in Joan Baez's vision, the grace of God is out, and it's luck of the draw, there but for fortune. So I think that's the kind of question, no matter how you want to look at it, that hangs over every story.
It's an amazing thing that you bring out, and some of the stories go back so early. I think the earliest one is in the late 1600s, another one, the chicken murders from 1770. How did you put those stories together? Was it all archival material and memories, or did you undertake research in some fashion?
I did, Gretchen. As I said, you know, my brother and I couldn't make out anything on those lengthy flyleaf notes except the line about those evil spirits, which was enough for us. I mean, you know, that just did us in. And my mother died in 2001, and I think it was around 2002. I had inherited the book with the flyleaf notations that belonged to the witchcraft judge, and I started to do some internet research. And the first thing I saw that got me really kind of revved up about it was that the witchcraft trial archives are on the internet. And I found myself looking at signatures of William Stoughton on death warrants for witches. And then looking at the same signature on the fly leaves of the books that we found in the attic, including this one with the fly leaf notes. I got really interested in it, and it was around 2002 or so. And I decided I can't do this by myself, dope it out. So I got in touch with the Oxford Bodleian Library archivist. And I said I had these flyleaf notes that were written by somebody who had been at graduate school in Oxford starting in 1650. And could she find me someone who could research and decipher all of these notes? And the archivist found a wonderful researcher, a graduate student then named Kirsty Jackson. And Kirsty deciphered all of the notes, and her deciphering is in the appendix also, and ran down all of the sources that Stoughton quotes in those flyleaf notes, in addition to some of his own kind of strange comments about life. So then the rest of it, and Kirsty was essential to running down those flyleaf notes. The rest of it, including the chicken murders, I was able to piece together by reading local histories of the Boston area, specifically Dorchester, which is right across, Dorchester Heights is in the Boston area. And there's a history of Dorchester, which goes into the chicken murders. And then there's a history of the area in Maine where my family lived in the mid to late 18th century and 19th century. And the rest of the story I could piece together with that. But basically, I could tell who owned the book at every point as it moved from hand to hand until it reached my brother's hands from the witchcraft judge himself.
Just remarkable that you were able to reconstruct that chain of ownership over.
But you ask about the chicken murders. I mean, that's the thing that brought it into my family, because the book was owned by at that point in 1770, let's say, by a Reverend Jonathan Bowman, who was at the church in Dorchester, and he'd been the preacher at the church in Dorchester for 40 years, and I think maybe he was having some dementia. But in any event, he had some chickens that he really cared about, his pet chickens, and they upset his neighbor very much, because I think they were, the neighbor was slipping and falling in what the chickens were depositing on his front steps. And the neighbor lost patience, and one morning he came out and shot the Reverend Bowman's chickens with his blunderbuss. And the Reverend refused to baptize the neighbor's child after he had become a chicken murderer. So he was not welcome to the baptism because of the murder of the chickens. And then poor Reverend Bowman, I think he went off the deep end, and he lashed out at the entire congregation in a sermon that's described in the history of Dorchester. And at that point, he was let go after 40 years as the minister. And his son, who lived in Maine, took him in, Jonathan Bowman, Squire Bowman, who had no interest in being a minister at all. He was a businessman, but he was looking for a minister to serve in the church in the real estate development that he was building in the area of Maine where my family was. And my many times great-grandfather had gotten out of Harvard with a divinity degree, and he was looking for a job as a minister, and he applied for the job. And Squire Bowman, the businessman, gave Freeman Parker, my many times great-grandfather, these books and from Stoughton. So that's how they came into my family.
What an incredible chain. was also struck by so many stories of resilience in the book. And there's a wonderful quote that you make, I'll just read it briefly, from Churchill. "Success is not final and failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." When you were telling the story in the book of escaping Turkey with your brother Tom and fleeing the police there in the wake of his trial and driving across Syria to Beirut, it seems like that was an exemplary story of resilience. Talk a little bit about if you felt that at the time and how you were affected by that experience.
You know, when you're in a tight situation like that, I think that you may be a little bit numb. I think I was a little bit numb, and what you're trying to do is survive and get through it, and take things minute by minute. I mean, and I think that's the way I felt. I didn't feel like I was being heroic or anything like that. My brother and I were just trying to get out of a really tight spot. And sometimes, gallows humor helps in those situations. And another situation with my brother, which I allude to in the book, when he and I were flying back from Nantucket on a Thanksgiving weekend in this decrepit and barely functioning secondhand airplane that he bought after college. The engine conked out at about 8,000 feet, and we were gliding down it like not like a helicopter, which drops like a rock, a little plane you can glide. We were gliding into the North Atlantic over Thanksgiving weekend, and we were smoking at the time, and I had a pack of Camels, and we were basically joking whether we could keep the glide going long enough before we hit the Atlantic to finish the pack of Camels. And again, I mean, you're just kind of numb, and all you can do is, at best, is maybe use a little gallows humor. Luckily, the plane got sputtering and going, and we went back up to 8,000 feet. And, it did that a few more times, but that's, I don't know, that's how you get through some situations.
Incredible. What ultimately happened to the books?
The books? Well, the books always gave me the creeps, Gretchen. And after I did the research, I decided I was going to sell a book. So I was always looking for some money because, like some of the characters that are talked about in the books, I was always running through money and looking for another source of it. So I decided to sell the books, and I sold the books. And William Stoughton is not like Abraham Lincoln, not the most priceless autograph in the world. And the books didn't bring an absolute king's ransom, but they brought enough to buy a pair of diamond studs for my wife's ears. And I thought that was a good use. So I got rid of the books that kind of gave me the creeps, and I bought Barbara a pair of diamond studs.
I think a lot of people would agree that you made a very wise choice. So I have many more questions, but I'm sure the audience does too. And Laura, can you share some of the questions that you've been receiving from the audience?
Sure. One of them comes from Dimitri, and this kind of takes us off in a political direction. I hope you're ready for that, Rich. The Talking Circle, he writes, "The Talking Circle has interested me since you first mentioned it to me. Do you believe that this format for conversation and discussion might have broader applications at a time when members of our society, particularly politicians, seem to be talking at one another or perhaps bypassing one another?"
Well, I do. And it was tried I can't remember the particular crisis that was in the Senate at the time, but the senator who was the chair of the committee decided to use the Talking Circle in order to get the committee members to work through an issue. And it didn't work too well in that situation. Someone on the committee ended up throwing the talking piece across the room. And so it didn't work. It doesn't always work. But I do think it's an incredibly powerful thing, and it was a magical experience for me, and I try to describe some of that magic in the book. And I wish I do. I mean, my thinking about the common shared human experience and common humanity that we all share is something that is good to think about in this time of tremendous divisions. I hope the book has a little bit of that message. I think our politicians would be great if they could get together in a circle, but I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon with any greater success than it happened in the Senate when it was tried.
So Rich, we're curious, what else was in that attic? I know in the book you give us a lot of details like Aunt Sally's clock, but you also noted that up in the attic, these steamer trunks are lined up row by row. What else did you find up there?
Oh, it's all kinds of stuff we found. You know, one trunk had uniforms of my grandfather and my uncle from the First World War, riding clothes, riding crops, bearskin lap robes for carriages. The trunk with the books had all kinds of family papers of no interest to my brother Sam and me at the time, but they included letters that I later just developed a tremendous interest in, to a 16-year-old girl who was in the family, like again, a number of times great grandmother, but at the time she was 16 years old and beautiful and blonde and had sparkling eyes and wanted to go to Boston to get an education, which I learned was really not unusual in the Enlightenment period. Women were demanding an education and she demanded it. But she was also 16 and pretty. And when she got to Boston to go to school, she wanted to go to parties with members of the opposite sex. And this got back to Wiscasset, Maine, and caused a lot of anxiety. And the letters are all about the anxiety that everybody in Wiscasset felt about the beautiful Rebecca, and what horrible things might happen to her in Boston if she went to parties with the opposite sex. So one of the chapters in the book is about that. And those letters were in the trunk. They're really treasures, I think. Many other family papers are there, which are, I've just scratched the surface of.
I have one anonymous attendee who wants to know about, do you think Harvard should change the name of Stoughton Hall based on his performance during the Salem trials? If not, why not?
You know, it's an interesting question, a very interesting question, Laura. And the thing that strikes me about Stoughton, obviously his legacy in forever in history will be a very dark legacy because of his role in the witchcraft trials. But Stoughton, I think that we don't know much about him, but he was definitely a human being, and he had tremendous love for Harvard. And again, we're on Indigenous Peoples Day. He left substantially all of his wealth to Harvard. And he gave the first building to Harvard. There are scholarships funded by his wealth today. And he stipulated that the certain groups of people should be preferred in terms of getting Stoughton scholarships. One were people students who came from Dorchester and the neighboring town. And the other group that he distinctly wanted favored were Native Americans. And he also stipulated that there should be a certain number, and I don't know the number, but I've read this, a certain number of rooms at Stoughton Hall should be available to Native American students free of any charge for room and board. You could say it's a little bit like, maybe like Robert E. Lee. After the Civil War, he became an educator, and he did good things as an educator. Maybe it's absolutely right to take down his statue in the public square in Richmond, but maybe his statue should still be at Washington and Lee. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, any more than the controversy about the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the Natural History Museum. But I think, like any human being, I think as bad a thing as the witchcraft trials were, there was a certain amount of significant good that Stoughton did, particularly for Harvard as an educational institution. So I can see arguing for Stoughton Hall staying Stoughton Hall, but I think the board of Harvard is going to have to make that call. But I would make the observation that he did some very good things for Harvard, and he did some very good things for Native American students in terms of his scholarship preferences. So that's my.
And that's pretty amazing. He established a scholarship back in the 18th century, and it's still live today.
Yeah, he died in, I want to say 1701, something like that. Not, not quite a decade after the witchcraft trials. And he had become, and it just jumps out of the flyleaf. When he was a Puritan who went to Oxford to study and do graduate work. As a Puritan under Cromwell's Commonwealth, he was in a favored class of people. And after Oxford, he got a good job, and he was all set to be a minister in England for the rest of his life. And then the Cromwell's Commonwealth, after Cromwell's death, collapsed. And nobody who was a Puritan was in much favor any longer. And he lost his job. He was out of work. He became, at that point, clearly, when you look at the notes on that flyleaf, absolutely obsessed with money. He was never again going to be in a situation where bill collectors were hounding him. And he went back to Massachusetts, fleeing the Restoration, where he was no longer welcome, and amassed what may have been the greatest fortune at the time in Massachusetts. He had no interest any longer in being a minister. Ministers could lose their jobs because the parish didn't like them anymore, because the political winds changed. And he clearly thought to himself, well, if you made enough money, nobody could kick you out. And he was a cranky, difficult human being who devoted his life to that and held on to money and power. And used his money and power in some ways for evil and some ways for good.
So another question, Rich, how did the belief in a family curse affect your outlook on life and that of your brother?
Well, in my case, I think it gave me kind of a warped view. There you had my grandfather, Brewster, who made a pile of money. He didn't live that long. He died in his late 60s. He was overweight and died somewhat young. His son was involved, and his older son was involved in a murder-suicide. And I thought, this money stuff is I don't like money. And my grandfather on my mother's side, on the other hand, was a penniless military officer. When not uncommon for his era. He retired just before the Second World War and then went back into service to be second in charge of civilian defense in New York State. But like Eisenhower, at the beginning of the Second World War, had one asset. It was an old station wagon. And that's the way military people often were, unless they were trustafarians. So I think my grandfather on my mother's side was penniless, but healthy, 80 years old, just the object of tremendous admiration by me and my brothers and sister. And I think, hey, having no money is good. You live long. Having money is bad. You have bad things happen. So I think I had this subconscious negative view about money. And so the curse ties into that.
So this is another question, knowing now the family tragedies and some of the setbacks you and your family encountered, in retrospect, would you trade your advantaged upbringing for a more mundane and normal existence?
No, I'm, I'm very happy with all of the blessings that I've got. And I think, again, it's a question of shared humanity. I mean, everybody has blessings and curses. I think if you look into your family and find out more and more, the more you dig, the more you find out, over a landscape of 400 years, there's a lot of adventure in my family, but there are also murders scattered across the landscape, a number of them. But a lot of excitement too. And you get what you get and you don't get upset. And I like it. Life is good. I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade my life.
Well, would you offer some advice for history teachers? Here's one listener who says, you're an excellent historian at a time when the teaching of history is in severe decline, particularly in high schools. What advice do you have for those who are responsible for designing curricula for schools? How do you convince schools that history matters? And a related question, Rich, someone else is asking if you could share any of the books that you read to research Witchcraft Legacy that might be of interest to the audience.
Sure. I mean, the going to the last thing first, I have a bibliography in the book. There was a biography of a very close friend of the witchcraft judge, Sam Sewell, who was very different from Stoughton. That was an important source of information on a personal level about Stoughton because they were close friends. There is a book called Good Old Dorchester, which has got incredible lore about Dorchester, which really was for a period of time in the 1600s, was the seat of power, I think more than Boston. That maybe, Laura, you would know more about that maybe, but it was certainly a very powerful center in that era. But good old Dorchester is a great source of material. And then there's a history of Dresden, which goes into the history of the part of Maine that gave me a lot of material about Squire Bowman and his real estate developments and all of his other enterprises that led him to want to hire my many times great grandfather to be a minister in the new church and basically his development. There are letters written by a friend of the girl with the sparkling eyes, which were published in the late 1800s. Letters from a girl 80 years ago. Well, 80 years ago in 1880 was when the girl with the sparkling eyes was a little girl. And those letters, also extremely literate letters by a very young woman in the Enlightenment, were a great source of information about Rebecca and about the times, and really the highly literate nature of the letters, and the letters that I found in the trunk were really extraordinary. But those are some of the books. I mean, as far as advice for history teachers, I don't know. I mean, I would say it's important to try to tell the truth, and the truth, or at least our understanding of the truth, changes over time. I know when I was learning history and I loved it in school, and I still love reading history. But we learned absolutely nothing about the history, the African-American history. And it's only more recently that there's been a focus on African-American studies. And that's appropriate because time moves on and educators realize that this was an omission. And I think it's good that that omission is being corrected. And you can have a pendulum swing effect, and you can say, well, things go maybe that in terms of teaching things, the pendulum swings too far, some might say, on a given issue, and to the point that it departs from the truth and it rewrites what history was all about. I'm not a fan of revisionism in the sense of altering the facts to suit current political thinking, but I certainly believe in changing the teaching of history to take into account things that we overlooked, like I think the history of slavery and racism in the country, which are very real. It doesn't mean that the society is racist, but it does mean that it was a history of slavery and racism, which are very important elements in our American culture and history that we should think about, read about, have conversations about. So that's a little bit maybe a mushy answer, but
Well, it ties in, Rich, to a question that just came in, and you certainly are getting some provocative questions. Your family history is so parallel to that of the country. Where do we go from here, where the truth doesn't matter anymore and the truth is malleable?
Well, that I would go back to what I was saying. I think that the truth does matter. There is no alternate reality. There is something called the truth, but perceptions of the truth can change over time. And I think that, Alexander Hamilton in the musical Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and I love the book on Hamilton that Lin-Manuel Miranda based his musical on, his rap musical on, Ron Chernow's book. And I loved every page of that book. And Lin-Manuel Miranda was so faithful to the book, so accurate and truthful in his depiction of Hamilton. And Hamilton was and always will be a great hero in many ways, a man brilliant, totally lacking in judgment, who was best when he was on George Washington's staff, working for a man who had plenty of judgment and could use a brilliant staffer. So the truth will always be important. And I think that we all should resist rewriting history in a way that's not truthful, but we should welcome expanding historical studies to include things that we've overlooked. I was a classics major at Princeton, and I just read an article in the Princeton Alumni Weekly that got me kind of upset because it suggested that the study of the classics was racist. And this was, I'm not sure that I got the message of the professor who is the center of the article right, but it sounds as if the thinking being presented was that the study of the classics was racist. And I mean, my comment on that, it goes to the point we've just been discussing, is that racists have always been around. There were plenty of racists over the course of American history. And because classical studies was at the center of really the Renaissance, which was an opening of the mind that benefited from classical studies, racists were among the students who studied Greek and Latin and Greek and Roman civilization. That doesn't mean that classical studies and the classics are racist. It means that racists studied them because they were around. So I got kind of upset because I think that to say that the study of the classics, which inspired the Renaissance, not only the Renaissance, but the Enlightenment, are very important and not at all racist. In fact, contrary. Horace, who I quote in my book, and have a lot of affection for Horace. Horace was the son of a freed slave, and Horace became the poet laureate of Rome and a close friend of the Emperor Augustus. These writers, like Horace and the Greek playwrights and poets, were at the very heart of the emergence of the world from the Dark Ages. And to reject the wonderful contribution that the classics had to bringing about the Enlightenment and open-minded thinking I think that does run some risk in frankly plunging us into a new dark age. And I think it's ridiculous, but.
Well, Rich, if I could reel you back in towards the book, I want to combine a couple of questions here. One, after discovering Stoughton's book in your attic, did you kids think that the 35-room Glen Cove house was haunted? And do you ever go back to that house? Is it still standing?
It's still standing. It was sold. My family sold it in the early, I guess, 1993 to 1995, somewhere around that time. My mother moved into New York City, and the house was sold, and everything was cleared out of the house, including the books and the furniture and everything. But I think I kind of did think it was maybe haunted. I mean, there was a basement in the house that was, in addition to the attic, which was kind of creepy with all those trunks lined up that looked like coffins. The basement, had dark areas full of cobwebs that I was afraid to go into because I thought those evil spirits might have escaped from the attic and gone on down and were lurking in the cobwebs in those parts of the basement. So I think at some level I did.
Do you think that the Witchcraft Judge's legacy influenced your career trajectory? You have worked in the public sector to advance justice in the criminal field.
Yeah, I think it did, Laura. I certainly, I didn't have any interest in practicing law when I went to law school. I was interested in government, and I went to law school to become a lawyer because I thought lawyers seemed to know more about government. First thing I did out of law school was to work in a political campaign. My candidate didn't win, so I thought, well, people who are interested in government go and practice law for a while, and then they go into public service. So I did practice law for a while. I went into public service in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I had a wonderful time doing that work as a federal prosecutor. And then I practiced law some more, and I got exhausted by practicing law. I guess when my older kids were just about out of college, I figured, well, I paid the bills, and I took another job in public service, which sort of took me through the rest of the course on my career. And I was in the New York State Attorney General's office. But yeah, I mean, I consciously went into those public service jobs because I wasn't interested in a money-making career. And I think that was part because of this partly conscious and partly subconscious legacy of the curse of, there's another thing that is quoted in the book, that money is the card that the devil plays to win the hand. To pays to play Trump and win the game. And I think that's, I thought that way kind of consciously or subconsciously. So I never pursued a money-making career. There you are.
So Rich, has your experience with this book caused you to think about writing another book? And if so, what might be the topic?
Honestly, Laura, I'm not thinking beyond this book at this point. It's quite an adventure. And it was a wonderful experience writing the book. It was a wonderful experience working with you, putting the book together in publishable form. And it's a wonderful experience working with Matt, trying to get the word out and market the book. But that's as far as I'm thinking. I'd kind of, maybe I'll come up with another idea, but I think I will probably enjoy getting back to being a mediator.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Gretchen as well for the lively conversation you had at the beginning of the hour. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Rich, if you want to say a couple final words before we say goodnight, and thank our hosts in Amsterdam at ABC, American Book Center, and Harvard Bookstore. And Rich, thank you for writing this really provocative book. Do you have a few last words you'd like to say before we say goodnight for the evening?
Sure. I mean, I certainly thank everybody who's logged into the event tonight. We have a lot of people who have been on the virtual event, and that's very gratifying. And once again, I'm just so grateful to Gretchen for joining me in the conversation, to you, Laura, and Matt, and to our co-hosts, the Harvard Bookstore and the American Book Center in the Netherlands. So I've got a lot of people to be thankful to for tonight and for the book. So good night all, and thank you all very much.
Good night.